Elias Kent lived in the house with too many locks. 4 bolts on the front door, a bar on the back, and windows nailed shut, though he hated the way the nails squealed against glass during winter storms. He claimed the locks kept the world out so he could write, but everyone in the shoreline town of Havenbrook understood that they also kept something in. Something only Elias recognized, or perhaps imagined. Either way, the locks were a promise. Disturbance would knock politely or not at all. Elias had once been a celebrated novelist. 10 years earlier, his first book had spent 14 weeks on national lists, and the sudden attention singed him like a moth brushing a lamp. Readings, interviews, strangers pressing their phones into his face for photographs. He managed 4 months of it before he broke down at the Baltimore airport and fled to the coast. Since then, he'd published nothing. But he still wrote, night after night, filling spiral-bound notebooks with stories whose plots no one ever saw. The notebooks were arranged in towers against the walls of his study. He told himself that one day, after things settled, he would mail them to agents. But the truth was that the towers comforted him like ramparts. If he wrote the world down, perhaps it would stay put. On a wet Monday in April, Elias finished a new manuscript titled The Willow Glass, a modest mystery about an art teacher who drowned in a river after discovering an embezzlement scheme at her school. He closed the notebook, smiled at the calm of completion, and set it on the desk beside his mug. 3 days later, the local paper reported that Caroline Harker, an art teacher at Harbor View Elementary, had slipped from the fishing pier and died. The sheriff, quoting unnamed colleagues, hinted at suicide. The photograph on page 4 showed Caroline's gentle smile, a face Elias had never seen before publication. Yet it mirrored the description in his story down to the dimple in her left cheek. Elias read the article 4 times, flipping between the notebook and the print with a sick heat blooming beneath his ribs. Coincidence, he decided, and went for a walk so forceful his calves cramped. Havenbrook's pier was cordoned off with yellow tape, gulls pacing the rail. He could smell seaweed and the faint chemical sting of boat fuel. Coincidence, he repeated, shepherding the word like a shield against the waves. The second overlap came 12 days later. Elias had written The Butcher's Apology, this time about a grocery clerk who suffered a massive heart attack at his register after hiding adulterated meat. 2 mornings after the final period, the same clerk, Royce Denning, recognizable by the turned-down ears Elias had described, dropped dead in the checkout lane of Bowline Market. Elias lay awake that night counting the pulsing of an artery in his neck. The stories were not fortune-telling, he reasoned. They were invented from scratch, conjured in a locked room. Yet the facts marched in step. Occupation, circumstance, minor details. No newspaper profile would bother noting the jagged pink scar on Denning's hand from a childhood burn, the lanyard of plastic dolphins he used as a keychain. Elias had put them on paper. Then they had walked into the real world and died. Memory scratched like rats in the walls. In childhood, he'd composed plays with puppets that seemed to mirror schoolyard rumors days later. His mother had laughed, called it coincidental clairvoyance, then died of an embolism while he was off at college. Elias had tried to write her a resurrection on notebook paper, but the pages stayed mute. For 48 hours, he stared at the ceiling, refusing food. By the 3rd dawn, he forced himself upright, poured coffee that tasted of rust, and dragged a fresh notebook from the shelf. If the act of writing summoned death, perhaps the act of rewriting could banish it. He opened The Willow Glass, tore out the final chapter, and drafted a new ending in which the art teacher survived the river and exposed her principal for fraud. The teacher lived, but the principal, an officious man named Holt, was shot during arrest, a stray bullet from a startled deputy. Elias finished at 6:17 a.m., hands trembling. He closed the notebook, placed it on the oaken floorboards, and waited. 2 days later, Havenbrook awoke to sirens outside Crestview Middle School. Principal Martin Holt had been fatally wounded when a student resource officer's gun discharged during detention. Television vans swarmed. The anchor pronounced the event tragic and bewildering. The dead art teacher was forgotten. It worked, Elias thought. Horror and relief knotted together. He had traded one life for another. He spent the next week experimenting. He selected a newspaper announcement of a wedding engagement, wrote a tale in which the bride-to-be was murdered by an ex-lover, then immediately rewrote it so that the ex-lover instead smashed his car into a tree at dusk. 3 days later, the obituary named the ex-lover, Jeffrey Lance, as the only casualty of a single vehicle accident on Coastal Route 14. The bride, it said, was safe but shaken. Thus, the pattern became plain. The death could be displaced but not erased. The stories did not create tragedy. They negotiated its target. Elias's pen was a divining rod for fatality, but only if guided might the current shift from one heart to another. He told no one. Who would believe him? And what could he say? That he curated the dying the way an editor curates adjectives. He could almost hear the padded cell door slam. In late May, he discovered that being custodian of the ledger made him responsible for its balance. Night after night, he scanned Havenbrook's residence like a chessboard, choosing pieces to spare and others to sacrifice. Though he sought a moral calculus, redirect death toward cruel, exploitative men, shield children and the gentle, events did not always oblige. Sometimes the victim he tried to safeguard reappeared days later in a different article, perishing in a way he'd never scripted. It was as though death corrected the ledger when Elias tampered too boldly. Sleep deserted him. When he did manage an hour, he startled awake, convinced he'd heard another bolt slide open in the dark. The towers of notebooks now felt carnivorous, rows of silent judges leaning inward. Havenbrook, meanwhile, became a town under siege from random calamities. Freak accidents, aneurysms, a gas leak, a collapsed deck at the marina. The sheriff called for calm. The mayor announced safety audits, but the sense of a rattling roulette wheel thickened in the fog off the Atlantic. On the first Friday of June, Elias received a letter. He rarely checked the mailbox except for utility bills, but this envelope bore his own handwriting. Inside, one torn page ripped from the center of a notebook. It read, 4 bolts on the door, a bar on the back, windows nailed shut. They came anyway. The line was his, scrawled 2 days earlier as an opening to a suspense draft he'd abandoned. He had never mailed it. He looked toward the study. The notebook tower listing slightly left, a gap where the page should have slept. Elias rubbed the goose flesh on his arms. He spent that afternoon pulling notebooks apart, verifying each sentence against the reality around him. The deeper he searched, the more overlaps surfaced from previous years. Events he'd dismissed as coincidence. A fisherman's drowning, a church fire, a teenage overdose. He'd always written them first. The revelation struck with cathedral force. He had been midwife to death for a decade, ignorant only of his own labor. Havenbrook's tragedies were a ledger balanced long before he'd realized he held the quill. In his panic, a decision crystallized like frost. He would end the cycle by writing a story whose sole death was himself. If the pattern held, he would die, nobody else. The town would be spared his collateral casualties, and perhaps, in that final barter, his mother's ghost would forgive the years of silence. He unplugged the phone, brewed tea he barely tasted, and titled the new manuscript, The Last Author. The premise was simple. A reclusive writer, burdened by visions, barricades himself in a coastal house. He pens a confession then, in deliberate peace, takes a walk into the sea at dawn. No conspiracies, no perverse twists, only solitude swallowed by tide and sky. As he wrote, a hush settled over the rooms. Hours passed, words ferrying purpose across the white expanse. He reached the final sentence. The water closed overhead, and he was gone, light rippling down where his footsteps had been. Then paused, pen hovering. To guarantee the outcome, he must not rewrite. He had to leave the death fixed. He closed the notebook. Midnight had folded over the world. Through the window, the Atlantic glistened under a half-moon, beckoning. Elias set the notebook on the foyer table, unbolted the locks one after another, and stepped onto the porch. The night tasted of salt and lilac. He descended the stairs, shoes whispering on old pine, and followed Surf Street toward the dunes. With each step he expected revelation, fear, regret, an angelic voice praising or condemning. But there was only the hush of sand lifting loose grains around his ankles. At the waterline he removed his shoes, stuffed socks inside, and rolled his trousers to the knee. The Atlantic lapped at his shins, colder than he dared imagine. His heart galloped. Another step, then another. The tide surged to his waist, fingers of current tugging greedily. A flashlight beam slashed across the breakers. "Sir, that you, Mr. Kent?" a voice called. It was Officer Myra Lung, Havenbrook's night patrol. She waded toward him, water soaking her boots. "You all right?" Elias blinked. Of all the nights, why tonight? The ledger resisted tidy resolution. "I'm fine," he answered, though the quaver betrayed him. "Just needed air. Let's get you home." She extended a hand. In the instant before he took it, he considered lunging farther, but his courage deflated like a punctured sail. He let her guide him back to shore. She didn't scold, only offered a silent escort up Surf Street until his porch light painted the steps gold. When the door closed, Elias relatched every lock. The notebook waited on the table like a benign trap. He had left his ending untouched, but perhaps intention mattered as much as ink. He'd attempted the sea, yet lived. Would the universe consider that death fulfilled, or would it demand another? Morning delivered the answer. The front page of the Havenbrook Gazette carried a grainy photograph of Officer Myra Leung. She had died in a rollover crash outside town at 4:07 a.m. Her patrol cruiser flipped into marsh grass. Witnesses cited a deer, late rain, poor visibility. Elias's knees failed. He slumped against the wall, the world wobbling. He hadn't rewritten a word, yet Myra had replaced him anyway, as though Providence refused his self-sacrifice. Or had his moment of hesitation, the unwillingness to drown, rewritten the ending in silence? Either way, death had exacted payment. Something splintered inside him then, a beam that had held his remaining sanity. Grief, guilt, fury spun together until they forged a reckless resolve. If the pattern would not accept his barter, he would collapse it entirely. He hauled every notebook into the yard, hundreds of them, story upon story, the past decade of invisible horrors. He built a pyramid, doused it with lamp oil, and struck a match. Flames vaulted skyward, pages curling like dying moths. The heat pummeled him, but he stayed until sunrise, coughing through smoke that smelled of ink and old fear. Neighbors gathered behind hedges, whispering, too wary to intervene. Fire trucks arrived, contained the blaze, and warned him about citations. Elias nodded numbly, eyes riveted on the charred crater where his prophecies smoldered to ash. He knew flames could not incinerate the words already loosed into the air, but destruction felt like prayer. "Let it end," he begged the indifferent sky. 2 nights later, sleep came mercifully. He dreamed of Myra walking along the pier, uniform crisp, no blood on her brow. She paused beside him, gaze neither blaming nor absolving. "Stories breathe," she said. "Decide what air you give them." Then she stepped off the edge and vanished, ripples swallowing moonlight. He woke before dawn, chest aching. Without turning on lights, he went to the desk, opened a fresh notebook, and sat. Dawn feathered gray outside the window. Elias considered the blank page, its possibility immense and terrible. What if he wrote no death at all? The question pulsed like a lighthouse, sweeping the dark. He began, "In a town salted by fog, people lived long, unremarkable lives. They quarreled and forgave, built sheds that leaned, planted perennials in whimsical circles. Sometimes they grew old enough to forget why they'd once feared shadows. No tragedies came uninvited, and when the ocean raged, the houses held. He paused, expecting dread, but felt only a tentative hush. He wrote on, every mundane detail he could conjure. Mrs. Donnelly's rhubarb tart, the annual dog parade, Coach Alvarez patching the Little League dugout. He filled 3 pages, risked a sip of water, then 5 more pages. 8, 12. Not a single demise bloodied the prose. When his wrist cramped, he set the pen down and waited. No sirens wailed, no phone rang with dreadful news. Outside, gulls argued over a crust of bread. Life, as far as his limited senses could tell, ambled forward unchanged. For the first time in weeks he laughed, a rusty, bewildered sound. Perhaps the pattern required narrative tension, stakes bound to mortality. Perhaps by refusing to offer death as an endpoint, he had starved the mechanism. Caution counseled patience. He gave the story 24 hours. He ate soup, showered, even opened a window for breeze, feeling fresh air move through the house like a newcomer. When the Gazette arrived the next morning with no fatal headlines, Elias wept. In the weeks that followed, he wrote daily. Stories of ordinary persistence, friendships rekindled, gardens thriving, storms endured without casualty. He mailed them, yes, mailed, to magazines that had once courted him. Rejections returned, as they always did, but a few editors scribbled encouraging notes. Subtle, kind, unexpectedly soothing. We'd love a revision. Havenbrook's roll of accidents dwindled to what statisticians deemed normal. The sheriff commented at Rotary Club that the weird streak seemed over. Residents resumed gossip about the price of fish and whether the boardwalk fireworks would be rained out. Elias never learned whether his new stories protected lives or simply refrained from dictating them, but the question lost its barbed urgency. He still locked the doors at night, though only 2 bolts now, leaving the others unlatched so breeze could rattle them like distant applause. Some afternoons he walked the beach, shoes swinging from his fingertips, and imagined Myra patrolling the shoreline beyond sight. Satisfied that he'd chosen a better air for the words to breathe, he would pause, close his eyes, and listen to gulls, to waves, to the murmur of a town alive in the folds of the ordinary. And though he knew death would someday write its own ending for him, he trusted it would not require his pen again.